The city streets were eerily quiet, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights flickering through the misty rain. The occasional car hummed past, its tires hissing over the wet pavement, but for the most part, the night was still. Sophie Carter tightened her grip on the steering wheel, blinking against the fatigue pressing at the edges of her mind. It had been a long, exhausting day at the clinic, and all she wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. Beside her, Ryan Brooks stretched his arms and let out a slow exhale, shifting in his seat. His police uniform was slightly wrinkled, the dark fabric still damp from earlier patrols. He rubbed his face, exhaustion evident in his features. "Finally heading home," he muttered. "I swear today was—" His sentence was cut off as the traffic light ahead flickered to red. Sophie eased the car to a stop, rolling her shoulders in an attempt to shake off the stiffness creeping into her muscles. The rhythmic tapping of rain against the windshield was almost soothing, a stark contrast to the chaos of her day. Then, something shifted. A strange, creeping unease settled in her stomach, an instinctive warning she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the late hour or the deserted streets. There was something else, a feeling that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Her gaze flickered toward a dark alleyway nestled between two old brick buildings to the left. The dim glow of a flickering neon sign barely illuminated the entrance, casting eerie shadows against the damp walls. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw movement, a shadow shifting just beyond the reach of the light. A chill crawled up her spine. "Sophie?" Ryan's voice was edged with curiosity. She exhaled, forcing a small shake of her head. "Nothing. Just tired." But before she could convince herself to ignore the feeling, it happened. A sudden blur of movement burst from the alley. Sophie barely had time to process it before a dog, thin, drenched, and frantic, came barreling into the street at full speed. Its golden fur, darkened by rain and grime, clung to its frail body, ribs starkly visible beneath the soaked coat. Its legs moved in a desperate, uneven sprint, paws slipping on the wet pavement as it bolted straight into traffic. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The blare of a car horn shattered the silence. A sedan sped down the adjacent lane, its headlights washing over the skeletal figure. Tires screeched as the driver swerved at the last second, barely missing the dog by inches. The retriever flinched but didn't stop. It kept running, frantic, wild-eyed, like an animal fleeing for its life. Sophie's pulse spiked. "Oh my God!" Before she could reach for the door handle, the dog suddenly changed course, heading straight for them. "Sophie!" Ryan's voice sharpened, but neither of them had time to move. The dog leaped onto the hood of their car. The impact made the vehicle shudder. For a split second, the dog's paws scrambled against the rain-slicked metal, claws skidding in a desperate attempt to stay balanced. Its breath fogged up the windshield, creating ghostly imprints against the glass. Sophie sat frozen, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart hammering in her chest. The dog's wide brown eyes locked onto hers through the windshield, pleading, terrified. Then, without hesitation, it moved again. With one last burst of energy, the retriever launched itself through the open passenger window. Ryan barely had time to react. "What the—" His hands shot up in instinct as the soaking wet animal tumbled into the back seat. Sophie twisted around, heart in her throat. The dog curled into the farthest corner, pressing itself against the door, its entire body trembling uncontrollably. For a moment, the only sound in the car was the shallow, uneven breaths of the terrified creature. Ryan let out a disbelieving laugh, running a hand through his damp hair. "Did that dog just jump into our car?" Sophie barely heard him. Her attention was locked on the animal. The sheer fear in its eyes, the way it pressed into the shadows like it wanted to disappear. It wasn't just lost. It wasn't just seeking shelter from the rain. It was running from something. She could feel it in the way its ribs expanded with each rapid breath, in the way its body flinched at the smallest sound. This dog wasn't just scared. It was desperate. Ryan shook his head in disbelief, shifting to get a better look at their uninvited passenger. This is weird, right? I mean, dogs don't just jump into random cars. Sophie swallowed hard. Yeah, they don't. Her eyes flicked toward the alleyway where the dog had emerged. The darkness beyond the streetlights felt heavier now, as if something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight. She had a sinking feeling that whatever this dog had been running from, it wasn't far behind. A gust of wind howled through the streets, rattling loose signs and stirring the puddles along the pavement. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger than before. Sophie forced herself to take a slow breath. She turned back to the trembling dog, its frail body still pressed tightly against the door. Gently, she reached toward it, palm up, offering reassurance. The dog flinched, not just in fear, in conditioned response. Sophie's chest tightened. You poor thing, Ryan sighed. Look, I know you have a soft spot for strays, but what if this dog belongs to someone? Sophie didn't take her eyes off the retriever. Does this look like a dog that's been loved? Ryan hesitated. For the first time, he really looked at the animal. The thin, ragged frame, the matted fur, the way its tail was tucked so tightly between its legs that it was barely visible. This wasn't a lost pet. This was a dog that had seen too much. Sophie's stomach twisted. How long had it been running? A quiet moment passed between them before she spoke again, softer this time. We can't just throw him back out there. Ryan exhaled, running a hand over his face. I know. He glanced out the window, eyes scanning the alleyway once more. But I can't shake this feeling that something's off. Sophie followed his gaze, the unease in her gut growing. The street was still empty, the alley silent. But that didn't mean they were alone. With one final look toward the shadows beyond the rain, she shifted the car into drive. Let's get him somewhere safe. The retriever didn't move as they pulled away, didn't make a sound. It simply lay curled in the corner of the back seat, as if bracing for whatever came next. Sophie didn't know where this dog had come from, what it had been through, or what had scared it so badly that it would leap into a stranger's car without hesitation. But something told her that this was just the beginning. She just didn't know of what. Yet. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet road filled the silence inside the car. The retriever, curled tightly in the back seat, remained motionless except for the rapid rise and fall of its chest. Its soaked fur clung to its frail body, revealing ribs that protruded beneath its golden coat. Sophie glanced at the rearview mirror, heart tightening at the sight of the trembling animal. Rainwater pooled beneath its paws, mixing with the faint streaks of dirt on the leather seat. The dog's eyes, wide, unblinking, darted between her and Ryan, filled with something beyond simple fear. This was more than just a lost or abandoned stray. Something had happened to this dog. Ryan, still shaken from their unexpected passenger, let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. Well, this is new, he muttered. Sophie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she carefully adjusted the rearview mirror to get a better look at the dog. Its ears were pinned back, tail tucked so tightly against its body that it was barely visible. Even the slightest movement from Sophie or Ryan sent a new tremor through its frame. She softened her voice. Hey, buddy, you okay? The dog didn't move, didn't react. Its gaze flickered toward the car door, as if contemplating an escape. Ryan turned slightly in his seat, his voice lower, gentler than before. Kong a, chung toi kong lam hai mai jiao? Still, Nothing. Sophie slowly reached out a hand, palm up, the way she would with a nervous patient at the clinic. The retriever flinched violently, pressing itself further against the seat. Then, in a barely audible sound, it let out a soft, trembling whimper. Sophie's heart clenched. She had seen fear in animals before. Pets abandoned, strays left to fend for themselves. But this was different. This was raw, instinctive. A kind of terror that had been ingrained through experience. Ryan frowned. Geez, it's like it thinks we're gonna hurt it. Sophie swallowed hard, her chest tightening. That's because someone probably did. Ryan exhaled, watching the dog with a mixture of concern and frustration. You think it was abused? Sophie hesitated before nodding. It's possible. The way it flinched, that's not just fear, that's learned behavior. Ryan muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. Some people shouldn't be allowed to have animals. She couldn't agree more. Taking a slow breath, Sophie tried again. Hey, sweetie. We're not gonna hurt you, okay? The dog still didn't move. Instead, it stared at her, eyes filled with something haunting, something that looked like a plea. Her gaze drifted down to its body. Its paws were muddy, fur damp and matted, and as her eyes traveled lower, she noticed something else, a small, fresh scrape on its right front leg. It wasn't deep, just a surface wound, likely from running through rough terrain or scraping against something sharp. Still, it made Sophie wonder just how far this dog had traveled. Gently, she reached toward the glove compartment, careful not to make any sudden movements. The dog's ears flicked, but it didn't react beyond that. She retrieved a small first aid kit, always kept in her car for emergencies, and opened it quietly. I just want to check your leg, okay? She murmured. As soon as she moved her hand toward it, the retriever snapped its head back, letting out a sharp, panicked yelp. Sophie froze. The sound wasn't aggressive. It wasn't a growl or a warning. It was fear. Ryan instinctively raised his hands. Whoa, easy, bud. Sophie stayed still, watching as the dog pressed its head down against the seat, its entire body locked in place. This wasn't just a reaction to pain. This was the reaction of an animal that had learned to expect the worst. Sophie exhaled slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Chak no tung trai kwa chuyen kin kung lam. Ryan was quiet for a moment, studying the way the dog remained tense, the way it refused to move even though it clearly wanted to. Then he noticed something else. Look at its collar, he murmured. Sophie followed his gaze. Around the retriever's thin neck was a faded old collar, worn and frayed at the edges. There was no tag, no nameplate, just cracked leather, soaked through from the rain, but something stood out. Embedded in the leather was a small, barely visible engraving. Sophie leaned in, narrowing her eyes as she carefully brushed away some of the grime with her thumb. Underneath, a series of numbers was faintly etched into the material. A serial code? An identification number? Ryan pulled out his phone, quickly typing the digits into a search engine. Let's see if anything comes up. The search loaded, but no immediate matches appeared. Sophie frowned. Maybe it's from an old registry? Or part of a rescue group's tracking system? Ryan copied the numbers into a separate database used for lost pets. If this dog was chipped or registered anywhere, we might get a hit. A tense silence settled over the car as the search processed. Nothing. No matches, Ryan muttered. That's weird. Usually, if a dog belongs to someone, even an old record would show up. Sophie's unease deepened. What if it never belonged to a family? Ryan looked at her. What do you mean? She hesitated. What if this dog wasn't a pet? Ryan frowned. Then what was it? Sophie didn't have an answer, but something about the collar, the numbers, and the sheer terror in the retriever's eyes made her stomach twist uncomfortably. Before she could think further, she reached for the door handle, intent on getting a better look at their surroundings. But the second the latch clicked, the retriever lurched backward, pressing itself further into the seat, its entire body shaking. Sophie froze, her heart sinking. It wasn't just afraid of them, it was afraid of being left behind. Ryan saw it too. Damn. He ran a hand over his face, sighing. That's not normal stray behavior. Sophie's throat tightened. It's not. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady patter of rain against the windshield. Ryan finally spoke. What do we do? Sophie looked at the retriever, at the way its trembling form had barely shifted, at the way it watched her like she was its only hope. We take it home, she said. Ryan let out another sigh but nodded. Just for the night. And then we find out where it came from. Sophie glanced at the dog one last time before putting the car in drive. Whatever this retriever had been through, whatever it was running from, it wasn't over yet. And somehow, Sophie had the sinking feeling they were about to find out why. The drive home was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of rain tapping against the windshield. Sophie kept glancing at the retriever curled up in the back seat, its fragile body pressed so tightly into the corner that it looked like it wanted to disappear. The way it stared at her, wary, exhausted but undeniably desperate, made her chest tighten. Ryan was unusually quiet as well. His eyes occasionally flicked toward the rearview mirror, watching the dog with the same cautious curiosity that Sophie felt. You sure about this? Ryan finally asked, his voice lower than usual. Sophie didn't take her eyes off the road. What choice do we have? Ryan sighed. We could have taken it to the shelter. She shook her head. That dog wouldn't have made it in a shelter, Ryan. You saw the way it looked at me back there. It's terrified, but it jumped into our car for a reason. Ryan ran a hand through his damp hair. Yeah, that's what's bothering me. Sophie understood what he meant. Dogs didn't behave like this, not without a reason. And that reason was starting to feel more unsettling by the minute. When they finally pulled into Sophie's driveway, she turned off the engine and twisted in her seat. All right, buddy, she said softly, looking at the retriever. Let's get you inside. The dog didn't move. Ryan slowly opened his door and stepped out, circling around to the back. Sophie did the same, rain pattering lightly against her shoulders as she approached the passenger side. She carefully opened the door. The retriever shrunk back instantly, pressing itself further into the corner, shaking. Sophie's heart clenched. It's okay, she whispered, crouching down to meet its gaze. I promise, we're not going to hurt you. Ryan sighed. This is going to take a while. He reached into the car, careful not to move too fast. The retriever flinched but didn't lash out. Instead, it watched him with wide, guarded eyes, like it was trying to decide whether to trust him or not. Come on, buddy, Ryan coaxed, his tone softer than usual. The dog still wouldn't move. Sophie bit her lip, thinking. Then she took a different approach. She reached into the grocery bag she had left on the front seat earlier, pulling out a small piece of leftover rotisserie chicken. She held it out, just inches away from the retriever's nose. The dog's nostrils flared. A long pause. Then, slowly, cautiously, it inched forward, just enough to take the food from her fingers. Sophie exhaled in relief. Good boy. The retriever chewed hesitantly, then licked its lips. It was still scared, still trembling, but it had taken a step forward. That was all Sophie needed. She carefully looped her fingers around its damp collar, making sure not to startle it, and guided it out of the car. The retriever hesitated but didn't resist. They made their way up the porch where Sophie opened the door to her house. She expected the dog to hesitate, maybe even refuse to enter. But the moment the door swung open, the retriever stepped inside on its own, as if it knew it was safe here. Once inside, Sophie grabbed a dry towel and gently patted the dog down. It let her, though its body remained tense. Ryan watched as she worked, arms crossed over his chest. "You sure about this, Soph?" She nodded. "Yeah." She knelt beside the retriever, running a careful hand over its damp fur. Now that it was under proper lighting, she could see just how thin it really was. Its ribs were sharply defined, its fur dull and tangled. Then, as she checked its underside, her breath hitched. There was a scar, an old one, faded but unmistakable, running along its stomach. Sophie's fingers hovered over the mark. "Rot quok I jan noi my truok jai," she whispered. Ryan frowned. "What is it?" She shook her head. "I don't know. But this isn't from an accident. It looks like an old wound." Ryan's expression darkened. "You think someone hurt it?" Sophie exhaled, still staring at the scar. "Maybe." The retriever remained still, letting her inspect it, though its ears remained pinned back. Whatever had happened to it, it remembered. Ryan pulled out his phone. "I'm running that number on the collar again. Maybe something will turn up this time." Sophie nodded, still focused on the dog. "I'll set up some food and water for him." She grabbed a bowl from the kitchen and filled it with fresh water, then poured a generous serving of kibble into another dish. But when she placed them in front of the retriever, it didn't move. Not even an inch. Sophie frowned. "Come on, buddy. You've got to be hungry." The dog only stared at the door. Ryan noticed, too. He lowered his phone. "Why is it looking at the door like that?" Sophie's stomach turned. The retriever wasn't just looking at the door, it was watching it, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. Ryan's search turned up nothing. No matches on the collar's number, no lost dog reports that fit the retriever's description. Nothing. "That doesn't make sense," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Even if it was from a rescue group or a breeder, something should have come up." Sophie chewed her lip, staring at the retriever, who still hadn't touched the food. "You really think it was running from someone?" Ryan asked. Sophie didn't hesitate. "Yes." Ryan sighed. "Great." As the night stretched on, the house remained eerily quiet. The retriever curled up in a corner of the living room, its body still tense, ears flicking at every small sound. Sophie decided to sleep on the couch just to keep an eye on it. It was around 2 a.m. when she woke up to a sound, a low, trembling growl. Sophie blinked, disoriented. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. She turned her head. The retriever was still curled in the corner, but its body was stiff, eyes locked on the window. Then Sophie heard it. A car engine, idling somewhere nearby. She sat up slowly, heart pounding. Carefully, she approached the window and peeked outside. A black sedan was parked at the far end of the street. Its headlights were off, but the engine was running. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, as if sensing her watching, the car pulled away, disappearing into the night. Sophie turned back to the retriever. It was still staring at the window, still trembling. It knew. Whatever, or whoever, it had been running from, had just been here. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden hues across the living room floor. Sophie sat on the couch, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in her hands, but she hardly touched it. Her thoughts were elsewhere, lingering on the events of the previous night. The retriever, still curled up in the same corner, had barely moved. It had spent the entire night in that position, eyes open, body tense. Even now, as daylight filled the room, it remained wary, ears flicking at every little sound outside. Sophie had seen frightened animals before, but this was something different. Ryan entered the room, running a hand through his messy hair. "Didn't sleep much either, huh?" Sophie let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Not really. He didn't move all night, didn't eat, didn't drink, just watched the door." Ryan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, that's not normal. Before Sophie could respond, Ryan's phone buzzed loudly against the kitchen counter. He frowned, walking over to grab it. His expression shifted as he read the caller ID. Animal Rescue Center, he muttered, then answered. This is Officer Brooks. Sophie sat up a little straighter, sensing the change in atmosphere. Uh-huh, Ryan said, his voice neutral but his eyes narrowing slightly. And he didn't have any proof? A pause. Sophie set down her coffee. Ryan's gaze flicked toward her. No photos, no paperwork, nothing. Another pause. All right, thanks for the call. He hung up. Sophie's stomach twisted. What was that about? Ryan exhaled, leaning against the counter. That was the rescue center. Apparently some guy showed up this morning asking about a missing retriever. Sophie's brow furrowed. Did he say it was his? Ryan nodded. Yeah. But here's the weird part. He didn't have any pictures. No lost pet flyers, no medical records, nothing. Just said he was looking for a dog that looked like ours. A chill ran through Sophie's spine. That's suspicious. Ryan nodded. Exactly. Normally, if someone's looking for a lost pet, they'd at least have a photo, a vet record, something. Sophie glanced at the retriever, still curled up but now staring at her, its amber eyes reflecting something unreadable. Did he leave his name? She asked. Ryan grabbed his notepad and flipped it open. Gave them the name Daniel Greaves, but I ran it through the system. There's no record of him under that name. Sophie frowned. So he either gave a fake name or... There's more to this than we realize. Ryan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started typing. What are you doing? Sophie asked. Digging deeper, Ryan muttered. If this guy went to a shelter, he might have been looking elsewhere too. Let's see if he has any priors. Sophie stood, pacing slightly. You think he's connected to why the dog ran? Ryan didn't answer right away. Then his phone buzzed with a result. His brows lifted slightly. Bingo. He turned the screen toward Sophie. The name might have been fake, but the description matched a man who had a documented history of animal neglect and mistreatment. Sophie's stomach dropped. He has a record, Ryan said grimly. Was investigated for keeping multiple dogs in poor conditions. Fined, but never charged. Sophie felt a wave of nausea roll over her. That means... Ryan nodded. Yeah. This dog didn't get lost, Soph. It ran. A silence stretched between them. Sophie turned back toward the retriever, who had been watching them both closely. Her pulse quickened. Had it understood? The dog shifted slightly, then, for the first time since they'd found it, began to move. Ryan tensed beside her. Slowly, cautiously, the retriever rose to its feet. Its paws patted softly against the wooden floor as it took a hesitant step forward. Then another. Sophie swallowed hard. Ryan, he's coming to me. The dog's body was still thin, still fragile, but something had changed. It wasn't pressing itself into the walls anymore. It wasn't frozen in terror. It was approaching her. Sophie knelt slowly, keeping her movements calm, steady. Hey there, buddy, she whispered. The retriever paused just inches from her outstretched hand. It hesitated. Then it pressed its nose against her palm. Sophie's breath hitched. Ryan stared. Holy! Sophie barely heard him. For the first time, the dog wasn't recoiling. It wasn't shying away. It was trusting her. She let out a shaky breath, her throat tightening. Mai jang konoi voi tao ju gi jung kong, she whispered. The retriever lifted its head, meeting her gaze. The fear was still there, but so was something else, something softer, something that looked an awful lot like relief. Ryan ran a hand over his jaw. Well, that's new. Sophie gently brushed her fingers against the retriever's damp fur. He knows we're trying to help. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned in. Ryan exhaled sharply. Sophie, I think this dog chose you. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat. Maybe it had. Maybe, somehow, despite everything it had been through, it knew exactly who it was meant to find. And somehow, Sophie had the sinking feeling that whatever had happened before was far from over. The night air was heavy, thick, with an eerie stillness that sent a quiet unease through Sophie's chest. Rain had stopped hours ago, but the pavement still glistened under the glow of the streetlights, reflecting the occasional passing car. Inside her home, Sophie sat on the couch, absent-mindedly rubbing the retriever's fur as it lay beside her, its body no longer trembling the way it had before. It had been a long day, one filled with unanswered questions, unsettling discoveries, and a growing sense that something wasn't right. Across from her, Ryan sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, likely checking for any updates on the man who had gone to the shelter earlier. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence wasn't comfortable. It was waiting. Sophie glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. And that's when she heard it, the distant hum of an engine idling outside. She froze. Ryan looked up instantly, his expression shifting. "You hear that?" Sophie's pulse quickened. She carefully pushed herself up from the couch and moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. A black sedan sat parked at the far end of the street. Same one as before. Her stomach knotted. Ryan was already moving, stepping over to her side, eyes narrowing as he studied the vehicle. "That's him," he murmured. Sophie swallowed. "How do you know?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "Because he's looking for something." As if on cue, the driver's side door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He wasn't in a hurry. He moved slowly, scanning the area, his gaze flicking from house to house. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his posture casual. But there was something off about the way he stood. Something calculated. Sophie felt the retriever stir beside her, its ears twitching, its body stiffening. It recognized him. She felt a surge of protectiveness rise in her chest. Ryan exhaled sharply. "Stay here." Sophie grabbed his wrist. "Ryan, wait." But he was already moving, disappearing down the hallway toward the front door. She turned back toward the window. The man was walking up her driveway. A sharp knock echoed through the house. The retriever flinched, but didn't run this time. Instead, it stood up, stepping closer to Sophie. She took a breath, steadying herself. Then she opened the door. The man smiled. It was forced, unnatural. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I heard through a friend that you found a dog earlier today. A retriever?" Sophie didn't blink. "Where did you hear that?" The man's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered. "Oh, I asked around at the rescue center this morning. I lost my dog recently, and I've been looking everywhere for him." His tone was carefully measured, his expression neutral. But Sophie didn't miss the way his eyes flicked past her, scanning the inside of her house. He was looking for the dog. Sophie tightened her grip on the doorknob. "If it's your dog, you should have some paperwork, a vet record, a picture." The man let out a short, airy laugh. Right, of course. I wasn't prepared when I went to the shelter earlier. I was in a hurry, you see." He tilted his head slightly, trying to peer further inside. "But I can describe him to you. Golden coat, medium build, very skittish. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?" Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears. Behind her, the retriever let out a low, warning growl. The man's smile twitched. Ryan's voice cut through the air. "If it's really your dog," he said, stepping into view, his tone cool, "then you won't mind if we verify that with the authorities." The man turned, eyes narrowing slightly as he took in Ryan's uniform. He hesitated, then forced another tight-lipped smile. "That won't be necessary. It's just a dog. No need to get the police involved." Ryan crossed his arms. "Oh, but I think there is." The tension thickened. For a moment, the man didn't move. Then, with a slow inhale, he took a step back. You know what? Maybe I was mistaken. Guess my dog's still out there somewhere. His smile never reached his eyes. Then he turned, walked back down the driveway, and got into his car. Sophie stood frozen, watching as the headlights flickered on. The sedan pulled away, disappearing into the darkness. A long silence followed. Sophie finally exhaled, shoulders sagging. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. That was him. Sophie nodded. I know. She looked down. The retriever was pressed against her leg, no longer trembling, no longer backing away. It had stood beside her the entire time, and its eyes, for the first time since she had found it, were not filled with fear. They were filled with trust. Sophie knelt, gently brushing her fingers along the retriever's head. You're safe now. The dog let out a soft exhale, then, for the first time, it leaned into her touch. Ryan smirked slightly. I think he made his choice. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat. Yeah, he had. And this time, no one was going to take him away again. The night air had settled into a deep, calming stillness. The tension from earlier had dissipated, leaving behind only quiet relief. Sophie stood at the door for a long moment, watching the empty street where the black sedan had disappeared. The house no longer felt like a temporary refuge. It had become a safe haven, a place where the retriever no longer had to fear being taken away. She glanced down. The retriever, her retriever, stood beside her, closer than ever before. His amber eyes weren't darting around the room in panic anymore. He wasn't cowering or trying to make himself smaller. Instead, for the first time, he was simply standing with her. He had made his choice. Sophie knelt down, her hands gentle as she brushed her fingers through his fur. It was still a little damp from the rain, still tangled from whatever past life he had escaped. But none of that mattered now. You don't have to run anymore, she murmured. The retriever let out a slow exhale, his body finally relaxing. Then, something incredible happened. His tail wagged, not just a hesitant twitch, not the nervous shifting he'd done before. A real full wag. A lump formed in Sophie's throat. She hadn't realized just how much she had been waiting for this moment until it happened. Ryan, standing a few feet away, let out a low chuckle. Well, would you look at that? Sophie swallowed, glancing at him. He trusts us now. Ryan smirked. More like he trusts you. Sophie smiled down at the dog, gently scratching behind his ears. I think it's time he had a name. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Got something in mind? Sophie studied the retriever for a moment. The way he had survived, fought, and somehow found his way to her. How he had chosen to trust again, despite everything. And suddenly, she knew. Lucky, she said softly. Ryan hummed in approval. Lucky, huh? Sophie nodded, still stroking the retriever's fur. Not just because he was lucky to be saved, but because... I think I was lucky to find him too. Ryan crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. So, let me get this straight. A terrified stray dog jumps into your car in the middle of the night, brings a mysterious criminal to your doorstep, nearly gets us into a full-on standoff, and you're saying you are the lucky one. Sophie laughed, the warmth of the moment easing the lingering stress from earlier. Yeah, Ryan, I think I am. Ryan smirked. Well, looks like you two were meant to find each other. Lucky let out a soft woof, stepping closer to Sophie, pressing his nose lightly against her palm. His way of agreeing. She smiled down at him, her heart full in a way she hadn't expected. Yeah, she whispered. I think so too. Sophie led Lucky to the living room, where she had already set up a soft blanket near the couch. She had assumed he would be hesitant to lay down, that he might still feel the need to curl into a corner like before. But to her surprise, Lucky stepped onto the blanket on his own. He turned in a slow circle, as if testing the space, then, with a long, exhausted sigh, he settled down, not in a fearful crouch, not on edge, but in real comfort. Sophie sat down beside him. Ryan plopped onto the couch, stretching out his legs. "Well, I don't know about you, but I could use some sleep after all that." Sophie chuckled. "You're telling me?" Ryan rubbed a hand over his face, still eyeing Lucky. "You really gonna keep him?" Sophie smiled. "I think that's up to him." She glanced down. Lucky was watching her, his golden eyes no longer filled with the same haunting fear as before. There was still caution, still remnants of whatever past had shaped him into the dog he was now. But there was also something new. Trust. And for the first time, Sophie had no doubt. Lucky wasn't going anywhere. The days that followed were a slow but steady transformation. Lucky still had his moments of hesitation, but the fear that had once defined him was starting to fade. He started eating his meals without needing coaxing. He followed Sophie around the house, never too far away. And, perhaps the most surprising change of all, he started wagging his tail more often. Each little milestone made Sophie's heart swell. Ryan had been right. Lucky had chosen her. One evening, Sophie sat on the porch, watching as Lucky sniffed around the yard. He still didn't stray far from the house, still seemed to keep a wary eye on the street, but he was no longer waiting for something bad to happen. She took a slow breath, staring at the sky. The stars above were bright, clear. It was peaceful. Ryan's voice broke the quiet. "So, what's next for you two?" Sophie smiled, glancing at Lucky. "I guess we figured that out together." Ryan chuckled. "Well, if I ever need backup on a case, at least I know who to call." Sophie smirked. "Oh yeah, because a rescue dog is exactly what your precinct is missing." Ryan shrugged. "Hey, you never know. He's already got the instincts." As if on cue, Lucky lifted his head, ears perking slightly at the sound of their laughter. Sophie reached out, running her fingers through his fur. "Whatever comes next, at least we know one thing for sure." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Sophie smiled. "He's finally home." Lucky pressed his head into her hand, his tail wagging softly. And that was all the confirmation she needed. As Sophie sat with Lucky curled up beside her, she couldn't help but think about all the other dogs out there, the ones still waiting, still hoping for someone to notice them. Ryan seemed to pick up on her thoughts. "You know," he said, "not every dog gets this kind of second chance." Sophie nodded. "I know." She glanced down at Lucky, who was already dozing off, finally at peace. Then she looked back at Ryan. "How many dogs like him do you think are still out there, waiting for someone to see them? Waiting for a chance to feel safe?" Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "Too many." Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat, gently stroking Lucky's fur. "They deserve a second chance," she murmured. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, they do." Sophie looked down at Lucky, at the dog who had once been so afraid to trust, now resting with the quiet knowledge that he was safe. For the first time in his life, he had a home. And for the first time, he wasn't alone. She smiled softly. "Welcome home, Lucky." His tail wagged in response, and that was the moment she knew. She hadn't just saved him, he had saved her too. Some stories have a way of staying with us long after they're told, especially those that touch on resilience, trust, and the profound bond between humans and animals. This is one of those heartwarming stories, reminding us that sometimes the ones who need saving the most are also the ones who teach us the greatest lessons. Across the world, countless abandoned dogs roam the streets, waiting for a second chance. Many of them have been let down, left to fend for themselves with no reason to trust again. Yet, despite their hardships, these animals still hold on to hope. Hope that the right person will see them, understand them, and offer the kindness they so desperately need. This story is a testament to the fact that love and healing don't happen overnight. Building trust takes time, patience, and compassion. It reminds us that animals, like people, carry their past with them, but with the right care, they can begin to heal. The journey of an abandoned dog finding safety is never just about survival. It's about rediscovering love, about realizing that they are no longer alone. For those who believe in the power of dog stories, this is a reminder of how much these animals have to offer. They don't just need homes. They need understanding, patience, and a chance to feel safe again. And in return, they give something priceless, the kind of loyalty and love that changes lives forever. There are so many animals out there, waiting for someone to give them a chance, waiting for a place to call home. If you believe that every dog deserves a second chance, consider adopting, fostering, or simply spreading awareness. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to change a life forever. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.